And with this, I would like to hand over to our first speaker, whom possibly also many of you know. He co-authored a great book, Blockchain Revolution, and is a co-founder of Blockchain Research Institute. Please welcome with me Alex Tapscott.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for that warm introduction, and thank you all for being here today. This is a very exciting time in human history, and that's because the technology that's likely to have the greatest impact on the economy, on government, and on society has arrived. But it's not autonomous vehicles or AI or biotechnology. It's actually the technology behind cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, and it's called the blockchain. This is the most important innovation in a generation and represents nothing short of the second era of the internet. Let me explain what I mean by that. So when you use the internet today to send and move and share information, you're not actually sending an original, unique thing. You're sending a copy, and you're retaining an original. Now, for most kinds of information, that's okay. In fact, for many kinds of information, it's a huge asset. It means I can send the same email to 1,000 different people. It means I can host a website and anybody can access it. It means I can type an entry into Wikipedia and it's available for all to see. So it's kind of like I have my own printing press for information. And it's had a very powerful democratizing effect on how we share and access and how we communicate. Except when it comes to things that have value, like, say, money, being able to send a copy is actually a terrible idea. So, ma'am, if I owe you $20 for something and I send it to you, it's very important that when you receive it, you know I don't still have a copy. Because if I had a copy of that money and I could copy it over and over again, then the money would be worthless. So it's great to have a printing press for information. It's not so great to have a printing press for assets or for money. And this is something that cryptographers call the double spend problem, and it's been an issue for a very long time. And because it's been a difficult problem to solve, even though the first era of the internet created tons of value, a lot of it was captured asymmetrically by middlemen, intermediaries, who we still rely on for a whole bunch of important things. So these intermediaries are familiar to many, of course. You got banks, you got brokers, you got other financial intermediaries, but you also have governments and increasingly digital conglomerates and big social media companies like Facebook. And these companies and intermediaries do a pretty good job, but they have some specific limitations. They're centralized, which makes them vulnerable to hacking or to attack. They add time and they add cost to business transactions. You know, sending money overseas takes 3 to 4 days and costs 10% on average. They exclude big parts of the population. There are about 1.5 billion people in the world who don't have access to financial services. And they capture data about us, which is problematic because it means we can't use that data to organize our life. We can't monetize it. It's worth something. And it could be used against us in some way. So even though the internet has created all this value, intermediaries have still captured, I think, a disproportionate amount, or perhaps an unfair amount. So what if the internet were entering a second era? From an internet of information to an internet of value, powered by blockchain and cryptocurrencies. And on this internet of value, not just information like emails and PDFs and things like that, but assets, money, stocks, bonds, identities, votes could be moved, stored, and managed securely and peer-to-peer, and where trust was not established by a third-party intermediary, but through a combination of collaboration, consensus, and clever code. So you have to ask yourself, how much would that kind of technology be worth to the global economy? The internet, the first era of the internet, by some estimates, is worth trillions of dollars. Except the internet, as we know it, is a free utility that was built by a combination of governments, corporations, volunteers, academia, and the like. And unfortunately, it wasn't really monetizable in the traditional sense. Lots of companies built on top of it and created lots of value, but the underlying protocols you couldn't own. Blockchain is different. As an early stakeholder in this network, you can participate in the growth of the second era of the internet by owning Bitcoin, by owning Ether, by owning some of the other foundational protocol tokens that make up this new economy. So if the first era of the internet is worth trillions of dollars, what's the second era of the internet going to be worth? In all likelihood, it's going to be worth more because the first era of the internet tackled information-based industries, media, publishing. The second era of the internet is tackling value-based industries, like financial services, which are much, much larger. So we hear a lot about the asset value that we've seen in this marketplace going from $20 billion this time last year to around $300 billion today. And people ask themselves, quite rightly, is this a bubble? And to be sure, there are certain assets which are massively overvalued. And there are others who are almost certainly going to fail. But looked at another way, this is the early innings of one of the biggest investment opportunities in a generation. Some of the leaders of the old paradigm have a slightly different view. So in December of last year, Jamie Dimon said that Bitcoin was a fraud. And this is something that's very common. You know, leaders of old paradigms have a hard time embracing the new. They treat it with derision, with dismissal, sometimes even with anger. But usually, history is not on their sides. And in January of this year, Mr. Dimon walked his statement back. He said, "Okay, I'm sorry, Bitcoin is not a fraud, but please stop asking me about Bitcoin. I just can't take it anymore." So this is the beginning of something profound. And it's going to impact every single industry. Take financial services. So the industry is a complicated one. It performs many different roles in the economy. But in the end, it really does, I think, 8 essential things. Gives people a way to store value, move value, prove who they are, to access credit, to exchange financial assets, to seek out risk capital, to start a business, to manage and mitigate risk, and to account for and organize financial information inside of a company. Every single one of these different functions of the financial industry is going to be transformed. And what's amazing about blockchain is that with this new operating system for the global economy, we're also seeing the emergence of a new asset class, which has at least 7 different types. I don't want to say this is exhaustive, but this is what we've seen so far. And I'm going to spend most of my talk walking through these 7 different types and explaining why they matter. So the first one, the one we know very well, is cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin. Bitcoin was designed to be cash for the internet, a way to move value peer-to-peer without an intermediary in a trustless manner. And what was amazing about Bitcoin is that it worked. And it worked so well that it's set off this spark, which is caught on like wildfire and captured the imagination of people in every single industry. When we wrote the book Blockchain Revolution, Bitcoin's value was around $7 billion. Today it hovers somewhere between $100 and $150 billion. And Bitcoin has become a lot of things. It's become the most secure payment network in the world, one of the largest computers in the world. It's also a system where billions of dollars of value is stored every single day, and it's used by tens of millions of people. And with the invention of new scaling techniques and solutions like the Lightning Network, Bitcoin could ultimately fulfill the promise of its creator and become not only money in the sense of store of value, but money in the sense of a global payment system. But there are other cryptocurrencies as well, Monero, Dash, Zcash, Bitcoin Cash, a fork of Bitcoin. What's interesting about certain ones of these, like Zcash, is that they focus on one specific implementation. In this case, it's privacy. Now, you might think, well, why would you need privacy in transactions? Well, obviously, there are lots of reasons. And there's applications for this technology even beyond currencies. So, for example, JP Morgan's Quorum blockchain uses the underlying technology of Zcash called zero-knowledge proofs in a wide variety of proofs of concepts for different assets. Because if you're buying a share in a company and you're trying to amass a position so you can take it over, it's kind of important that nobody knows who you are. So is this cryptocurrency phenomenon a risk or an opportunity for banks? The first time ever, JP Morgan and Bank of America said in their annual risk assessment that cryptocurrencies could potentially disintermediate big parts of the organization. But on the other hand, it's also a brand new asset class, and it could be a big opportunity. So Goldman Sachs is the largest investor in a company called Circle, which announced recently the acquisition of a cryptocurrency exchange called Poloniex. So Goldman Sachs is participating indirectly in the cryptocurrency boom. The second category are platforms. So the one that most of you would be familiar with is Ethereum. Who's heard of Ethereum? Just raise your hand. Yeah, so just about everyone, right? So people in the media say Ethereum is going to take over Bitcoin. Ethereum is the new Bitcoin. That is a fundamentally ridiculous thing to say because they do very, very different things. Bitcoin was designed to be a secure medium of exchange for the internet. Ethereum is a general purpose platform that allows you to build what's called decentralized applications and smart contracts. So smart contract basically is business logic written in code that can mimic what a typical business agreement does, but with guaranteed execution, enforcement, and payments, and where you don't need intermediaries like banks, brokers, courts, et cetera, to enforce the terms. And Ethereum has also become the proto-investment bank, in essence, for this entire industry. Last year, we heard $6 billion of ICO activity happened in the blockchain space. Somewhere around half of that happened on the Ethereum network using a standard called ERC-20. So hundreds of new applications, new companies, new projects are built on Ethereum, which gives it very powerful network effects. And you can think of Ethereum, the network, kind of like the grid of the city of Zurich. And the application that runs on the network is kind of like the car. Ether, the token, is the fuel or gas in crypto language that powers the application along the grid. So the more applications that get built, the more users they drive, the more transaction volume they create, the more demand there is for an underlying token whose supply and quantity and rate of growth is known and fixed over time. So as a result, if you think all these applications will get built on Ethereum, then demand for Ether obviously is going to go up. But Ether is not the only one. Since it came out, dozens of new protocols, platforms have emerged that try to challenge it in certain ways. And these so-called third-generation blockchains basically try to solve for a few different things, right? The first one is scalability. Right now, if you wanted to run the NASDAQ on the Ethereum network, you couldn't do it. There's not enough network capacity to manage that many transactions. That doesn't mean it won't happen. In 1993, you couldn't run Netflix on the internet. You couldn't even download a web page. But of course, technology self-improves, and eventually it was able to do that. Still, these new platforms are focused on scalability. Interoperability. We can't have hundreds of blockchains that can't talk to each other. Otherwise, what's the point? So that's very important. Customization, smart contract capability, being multi-asset and multi-industry in function. And interestingly enough, being public, but with the ability to do private implementations. There are lots of legitimate enterprise and non-enterprise use cases where a private off-chain or side-chain transaction might make sense. So if you look at the market today, roughly a third of the value of all crypto assets fit into this category called platforms. The third one, utility tokens. So the utility tokens are native blockchain assets that operate within an application ecosystem. And there are lots of different kinds of utility tokens. So Golem, the second one to the right there, is a distributed computing network, which basically wants to marshal the resources of all of our devices to compute instead of having to use Amazon. Its token is a native payment system inside of the application. Augur is a prediction market, so you can bet or wager on the outcome of future events. And owning Augur allows you to act basically as what's called an oracle. So Augur's token isn't so much like a security, it's actually more like a seat on the stock exchange. It's a place at the table that allows you to earn value by being part of an application ecosystem. And if you look at 2017, the vast majority of ICOs that happened were for so-called utility tokens. And there are lots of very legitimate use cases for utility tokens. However, I'm very skeptical that all of the tokens that were launched last year were utility tokens. In fact, I think many of the projects that launched had no legitimate use case for their token, which is actually not necessarily a bad thing, but what they should have done is just issued equity on the blockchain. And that leads me to the next category. Before I do, this uncertainty that's been created in the regulatory world is creating a shift from ICOs to other kinds of token offerings. Now, last year at the peak of the craze, we saw countries in China and Korea and elsewhere really clamping down on this. Since then, Korea and Japan have loosened up quite a bit, and we've actually seen a lot of progress from regulators in the United States and elsewhere. Still, what happens with technology is that the technology races ahead. And when the technology races ahead, the regulations lag behind. And that gap creates uncertainty. And that uncertainty creates volatility, where people don't know what the rules of the road are, and they're trying their best to figure it out. So we need to create a system where the rules and the technology, if not in harmony, are at least generally in sync. And this leads me to the next category, which are security tokens. So I think the total value of actual security tokens is maybe in the tens of millions of dollars. There were a few examples of projects that did this last year. But I think that this category is ultimately going to meet and eclipse the value of all other crypto assets, because it's worth taking a step back and putting it into perspective. The value of the crypto asset market today is $300 billion. The value of the global equity market is $110 trillion. The notional value of derivatives outstanding is over $650 trillion. And there's no reason why other kinds of assets shouldn't be native digital assets that clear, settle, move, store, manage across blockchains. Now, this is particularly true where there's no underlying physical asset. So a stock or a bond. A stock is really just a contract that entitles you to a fractional share of a common enterprise and a share of that company's earnings or cash flow in the form of dividends or what have you. So all of that is a contract. So all of that business logic can be collapsed into a token. You don't need clearinghouses and exchanges and brokers and cages and agents and all the other third parties that go into moving shares between people. You know, the time it takes to make a stock transaction on most markets is still T+2 or T+3, meaning 2 or 3 days when it should be 2 or 3 seconds. So I think that the next couple of years, it's not unreasonable to assume that trillions of dollars of new securities will be listed on the blockchain. Beyond that are tokens that are backed by physical assets in the real world. Now, these are a bit more complicated because we can't just put it all on the blockchain. In the end, someone still needs to take physical delivery of an asset, like, say, gold or silver or oil or natural gas or timber or any other commodity. But we can take the clearing and settling and the processing and turn it into a peer-to-peer transaction. Now, what's really exciting about natural asset tokens aren't established markets like gold and oil, but what I call frontier markets, like air or water or carbon. So there's a theory in economics called the tragedy of the commons, where there's an asset that sits in the commons and nobody owns it. And all the people in the commons use it and ultimately exploit it. And the outcome of that are negative externalities that are borne by society. So we all experience it. A great example of this is carbon, right? There's carbon in the ground, there's carbon in the air, we burn it, we use it, and the cost isn't borne by the company that burns it, it's borne by the planet, and it's borne by society. Could we create marketplaces for carbon, for example, where it's not just governments and big companies that get to benefit from reducing their footprint? Could it also be that individuals get to benefit as well? So you go to the store and you make a purchase and it's carbon neutral. Why can't the store reward you as a loyalty point scheme with a carbon neutral credit? So all of a sudden we can empower individuals to get financially compensated for reducing their impact on the planet. That is a huge shift that I think could make an enormous difference for the world. My favorite category are crypto collectibles. So who here has a crypto kitty? Raise your hand. That's pretty good, actually. So crypto kitties, it's amazing, amazing distributed application, one of the most successful ever on Ethereum, where you can purchase a unique collectible digital asset that is not fungible and not replicable. So there can only be one version of a crypto kitty. And at the peak of the market mania in December, a crypto kitty sold for its equivalent Ether value of over $100,000. And peaked in January at around $250,000. And this became very personal for me when a good friend of mine told me that he was getting very serious with his girlfriend. And I asked him, how serious? And he said, well, we're thinking of breeding our crypto kitties together to create a crypto baby. So I guess that's a new spin on let's get a dog, right? So Elon Musk says silly and fun things are important, and the same thing is true for this. What CryptoKitties demonstrates is that you can actually have unique digital assets, and there are tons of different kinds of unique digital assets, not just CryptoKitties. It could be everything from art to music, film, land or assets in virtual worlds, which is already a huge and established market, especially in gaming. And even potentially you could ICO an individual. You could do a Kim Kardashian ICO and sell collectibles that represent parts of her fame and fortune. We'll see how far that gets. I don't know if there's any buyers in the room here, but there's a huge, huge opportunity for crypto collectibles. And then the other thing is that in the same way that we can have a digital facsimile for a physical asset, like gold, we can have a digital facsimile for a physical asset like art, or diamonds, or a bottle of wine, which each one is unique, and we can use the blockchain to track individual assets. And if you needed any more validation, Andreessen Horowitz invested $12 million in CryptoKitties last week. The final category are crypto fiat currencies and stable coins. So we heard a little bit about crypto fiat currencies. Basically, the argument goes like this. Bitcoin is too volatile to be used as a medium of exchange. Merchants won't accept it, landlords won't accept it, so we need something that's more stable. There are two ways of doing this. One is for a government to basically issue its own currency on the blockchain, create a crypto fiat. Another is via this system called a stable coin, which basically tries to manage the price within a certain band, either because it's pegged to an asset in the real world, like gold or dollars, or through sort of a dynamic supply system. And stablecoins have become increasingly popular, but they've also attracted a lot of heat. It's sort of odd, like if you want to have the equivalent of a fiat currency, why would you trust a small corporation to issue it? Why wouldn't you just trust the government? You may trust Bitcoin more than you trust fiat, but you're probably going to trust fiat more than some little stablecoin that's being issued by some company, right? So a lot of people figured, well, it's going to be the ECB, or it's going to be the Bank of England, or it's going to be the Fed that issues a crypto fiat currency. Wrong. Sorry to disappoint. The first crypto fiat currency, if you want to call it that, is this thing called the petro in Venezuela. Now, the petro has a few things that are going against it. It says that it's backed by oil in the ground. There's no evidence of that. They say it's decentralized. There's no evidence of that either. And there are lots of reasons to believe that it's a scheme by the country's oligarchs and politicians to enrich themselves. But what's interesting is that Venezuela, Iran, Russia, these are the countries that have talked about doing a crypto fiat currency. What do they all have in common? Well, they all have a lot of oil. They all are not in great standing with the United States, and they're all suffering from sanctions. So the Venezuelan government sees the crypto fiat petro as a way to circumvent sanctions. I don't know if it's going to succeed. I would probably bet against it. I certainly would encourage anybody to go near it. But what it demonstrates is that this can actually work. And if anything, it's a rallying cry for more responsible governments in parts of the world like Switzerland and Europe and the United States to get on top of this so that they too can lead in this new era. And yeah, I always put a photo of Trump in my deck, especially in Europe, because it's a really, like, you know, you're a favorable audience for that kind of thing. So yeah, unsurprisingly, Trump banned it, which shows that even in the world of crypto, old rivalries and laws still apply. So that's 7 categories of crypto assets. And crypto assets are one component of the blockchain revolution. There are lots of other use cases that don't involve assets, but the technology that's driving these assets, I think, is the most exciting part. So I want to talk briefly about regulations. So just to be clear, regulators are not the enemy. Regulation is good, but the regulation needs to be done correctly. You know, we need to stop fraudsters and criminals from issuing ICOs and ripping people off. But on the other hand, we can't go too far as to stop the innovation from spreading. And I'll give you a good example. So in 19th century England, the government of London introduced these things called the red flag laws. And the red flag laws basically said that if you wanted to operate a motor vehicle, what they called a horseless carriage at the time, you needed 3 people: a driver, a spotter, and a man walking in front of the car waving a red flag. Which makes you wonder, isn't the point of a car so that you can have freedom and autonomy and you can go anywhere? Kind of defeats the purpose if there's some man in a top hat waving a red flag in front. So their logic was basically this. You got horses and pedestrians and people who don't know what this thing is. You need to alert them of this new oncoming contraption. And those laws were on the books for decades. And some say that it's the reason why the UK ended up ceding leadership in automobiles to the United States, is because of the unintended consequences of regulations. So regulators need to think very hard about this, which is how I get to this. Welcome to sunny Crypto Valley. So I've been here for 3 days. I'm thinking of moving here. It's terrific. And I'm not just saying that because Olga gave me a cake last night. I'm saying that because this is an interesting petri dish of innovation that's happening in Switzerland. You might originally think that, well, there's a bit of regulatory arbitrage happening here, that the reason that companies and projects are domiciling is because of a more favorable treatment, and that's true. But what's happened over the past 3 years is actually quite remarkable. So the Crypto Valley Association has over 650 member companies. In the past 2 years, over 3,000 very good jobs have been created just in the cryptocurrency and blockchain industry, according to Lakeside Partners, and at least 1,000 of them are in Zug, a city with 20,000 people, which basically means that if you're having a coffee at a coffee shop, you've got a 5% chance of sitting next to someone who works in this industry, which is kind of amazing. So good regulations, smart regulations, can create the conditions to actually build real wealth and real value. And it's important because there's lots of different businesses here that blockchain can transform. Everything from financial services to manufacturing to the sharing economy to the energy industry and everything in between. And I wish I could go into more detail, but we're running out of time. So there's lots of reasons why this technology is important, ways in which it could change the world. There are also a lot of reasons why it might not reach its potential. So many that in the first edition of Blockchain Revolution, we dedicated a whole chapter to it. We said, showstoppers, reasons that blockchain might fail. And there are lots of reasons. Can the technology scale? How will it be governed? Will governments react positively or negatively? How will incumbents treat this new technology? Will they embrace it? Will they crush it? Will they co-opt it? Is blockchain a job killer? And of course, will distributed autonomous organizations gain sentience and enslave humanity and create Skynet, which, you know, is a possibility. At least I used to watch Terminator, was my favorite movie. So in a way, I kind of want that to happen in a really sick way. But anyway, you have to ask yourself, are these reasons that this technology is not worth our time, why it's not a good idea, or are they implementation challenges to be overcome? And I think in each example, they're an implementation challenge, and they can be overcome by leadership. And that means that leadership, as everyone here, is personal opportunity. So what can you do? The first thing is personal use. If you don't own any of this stuff, then you can't really be part of this conversation. And I don't mean like go blow your savings. I mean just go buy some Bitcoin, send it to a friend, get a feel for it. There's a couple of, Bill Barheit's talking here, Abra is like a piece of cake to use. Just use that to buy some Bitcoin. It'll take you no time at all. The second thing, education. The first thing you should do the moment you all leave here today is buy my book. No, the book has been out for almost 2 years. It still holds up okay, but in a lot of ways it's kind of become irrelevant, which is why, or obsolete, which is why we're releasing a new edition in June with 2 new chapters. So maybe hold off until then. No, educate yourself. Crypto Twitter is a highly informative and entertaining place to spend some time, wade through the waters. But get involved, educate yourself. Investment, developing strategies, and launching pilots. Investment, you can choose to be an investor in this industry or not in terms of the crypto assets, but invest time and energy and invest your focus in this. You know, you could be a business leader and you're trying to understand how this technology affects you. Launch a pilot, develop a strategy. And the most important thing is to start now. There's an old parable about the invention of chess, and it goes something like this. The king is so pleased with this amazing invention that he goes to the inventor and he says, I will offer you anything in the kingdom, whatever your heart desires, as a reward. And the inventor says, Sire, you are so kind and generous. I am but a humble servant. All I want is some rice to feed my family. But I want you to give it to me in this way. 1 grain on the first piece of the chessboard, 2 grains on the second, 4 on the third, and so on. And the king, who I gather is like not a math guy, says, how much rice could that be? You know, a bag of rice, a barrel of rice, whatever. It says your wish is granted. But 4 becomes 8, becomes 16, becomes 32, 64, and so on. So by halfway through the chessboard, it's more rice than the entire kingdom produces in a year. And by the end of the chessboard, it's enough rice to cover the entire planet in 6 feet of rice. So I think the first era of the internet took us through to the middle of the chessboard. We're dealing with a time of great change and great upheaval. But the next phase is going to be even more disruptive. So all I can say is don't be afraid and join the revolution. Thank you very much.